Every building holds at least one room nobody visits anymore. A door that doesn't open easily. A staircase that stops at a wall. A space behind a bookshelf, under a floor, sealed inside a hillside, built for a reason, used for a while, and then, slowly, forgotten by everyone who once knew it was there. Tonight, we're going to visit 30 of them. Real rooms, real doors. Some opened again after thousands of years, some still sealed right now, tonight, exactly as they were left. You don't need to remember which room is which. Just let each door open quietly and close again just as quietly and drift on to the next. Let's start with the most famous sealed door in the world, the one that stayed shut for 3,000 years. The door that stayed shut for 3,000 years. On November 26, 1922, archaeologist Howard Carter made a small hole in a sealed doorway deep in Egypt's Valley of the Kings, held up a candle, and looked through into a room no living person had entered since around 1323 BCE. Behind him, his patron Lord Carnarvon asked if he could see anything. Carter's answer has become one of the most quoted lines in archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. The room was the antechamber to the tomb of a young pharaoh named Tutankhamun, who had died around the age of 18 or 19, and whose burial, unlike almost every other pharaoh's, had never been found and emptied by tomb robbers in antiquity. Inside, gilded chariots, dismantled and stacked against the walls. Golden shrines nested one inside another like a puzzle box. Alabaster vases, a golden throne, thousands of individual objects, layered in careful, ancient disorder, exactly as they'd been left by the burial party over 3,000 years earlier. It took Carter and his team nearly 10 years to fully catalog everything in that tomb. One room sealed and left alone for 3 millennia, holding more golden objects than had been found in all of Egyptology before it, combined. Some rooms were sealed by accident and opened by discovery. Others were built to stay dark on purpose for one single day a year. The room that only fills with light once a year. In County Meath, Ireland, there's a massive circular mound of earth and stone called Newgrange, built roughly 5,200 years ago, older than Stonehenge, older than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Inside, a narrow stone passage stretches 60 feet toward a small chamber at the mound's heart, its corbelled stone roof still watertight after 5,000 years without a drop of modern mortar. For 364 days a year, that inner chamber sits in complete and total darkness, but its builders included a small opening above the entrance, called a roof box, precisely aligned so that on the morning of the winter solstice, a narrow beam of sunlight creeps down the entire length of the passage and floods the inner chamber with light for about 17 minutes. Modern engineers studying the alignment have confirmed it's far too precise to be accidental. Neolithic farmers, without writing, without metal tools, calculated this angle correctly enough that it still works, unchanged, over 5 millennia later. A room built specifically to hold darkness all year, except for 17 minutes every winter, when it was built deliberately to hold light instead. Some rooms were built for a single day of light. Others were simply built for keeping things quietly for thousands of years. The stone dresser nobody ever got to use again. On the windswept coast of Orkney, Scotland, a storm in 1850 stripped away a grassy dune and revealed something remarkable: a small Neolithic village called Skara, Brae, buried in sand for roughly 4,000 years, its stone houses almost perfectly preserved. Because the surrounding landscape had almost no usable timber, the village's builders made nearly everything from stone instead, including in nearly every house a stone dresser standing against the far wall, facing the entrance, exactly where a modern visitor's eye goes first upon walking in. Archaeologists believe these dressers displayed the household's most valued objects, a kind of 5,000-year-old mantelpiece meant to be the first thing seen by anyone who entered. Alongside the dressers, each house held stone box beds and small stone-lined boxes set into the floor, sealed with clay to be watertight, believed to have stored bait or shellfish, a kind of Neolithic pantry, tucked into the floor of a room that its owners left, for reasons still not fully understood, sometime around 2500 BCE. A stone shelf, still standing exactly where someone once arranged their most treasured things, wading through 4,000 years of sand for anyone to come looking again. Some rooms held objects. One held something rarer, an entire civilization's memory pressed into clay. The room where a library was made of clay. In the ancient Assyrian city of Nineveh, in what's now northern Iraq, the palace of King Ashurbanipal once held a room unlike almost any other in the ancient world. A library, but not of scrolls or paper, of clay. Ashurbanipal, who ruled in the 7th century BCE, was, unusually for a king of his era, personally literate, and he ordered scribes across his empire to collect and copy texts of every kind: medical texts, astronomical records, legal codes, and the oldest known version of a story we now call the Epic of Gilgamesh, pressing each one into wet clay tablets with a wedge-shaped stylus, then drying or firing them. When Nineveh was destroyed in 612 BCE, the fire that burned the palace did something unexpected. It baked the clay tablets hard, like pottery in a kiln, accidentally preserving thousands of them for over 2,500 years, buried beneath the rubble of the very city that had once housed them. Rediscovered by archaeologists in the mid-1800s, the tablets are still being translated today, a library destroyed by fire that the fire itself ended up protecting. A room built to hold memory, burned to the ground, and saved by the very disaster that ended it. A library preserved by fire, a palace preserved by legend, so tangled with myth that for centuries people weren't sure it had ever really existed. The palace with 1,000 rooms and a monster at its center. On the island of Crete, the ancient Greeks told a story about a vast, confusing palace called the Labyrinth, built to contain a monster called the Minotaur, half man and half bull, a maze so complex that no one who entered could ever find their way back out. For a long time, this was treated as pure myth. Then, starting in 1900, British archaeologist Arthur Evans began excavating a real palace complex at a site called Knossos and found something that may have helped inspire the legend: a genuinely vast structure with well over 1,000 interconnected rooms, corridors, and staircases, covering more than 6 acres. The palace, built and rebuilt by the Minoan civilization starting around 1900 BCE, included storage rooms lined with enormous clay jars, elaborate plumbing with what may be the earliest known flushing toilet, brightly painted frescoes of bulls and dolphins, and a floor plan so genuinely complex that modern visitors still sometimes lose track of which corridor leads where. Evans's own restoration work has been debated by later archaeologists as overly imaginative in places, but the underlying scale of the palace itself is real, a genuine architectural maze built for a real Bronze Age civilization that may have quietly become, over centuries of retelling, a monster's prison instead. 1,000 real rooms, and one story about a monster, tangled together so thoroughly across 3,500 years that it's genuinely hard to say anymore where the palace ends and the myth begins. Some rooms became legend. One hidden room, discovered just a few years ago, was found without anyone ever setting foot inside it at all. The room found without anyone ever going in. The Great Pyramid of Giza has been studied, measured, and explored for well over a century, and in 2017, scientists still found an entirely unknown space inside it, without drilling a single hole or setting foot inside. The technique, called muon tomography, uses naturally occurring particles called muons that constantly rain down from the upper atmosphere and pass through solid stone. By placing detectors inside and around the pyramid and measuring exactly how many muons passed through different areas, researchers could map out places where more muons got through than expected, a sign of empty space hidden inside otherwise solid stone. The scan revealed a previously unknown void, at least 100 feet long, sitting above the pyramid's grand gallery, now known as the Big Void. Its exact purpose remains genuinely unknown. It could be a construction gap, a hidden chamber, or something else the pyramid's builders intended entirely. As of the most recent published research, nobody has physically entered it. It remains exactly as it's been for roughly 4,500 years, mapped, confirmed, and still completely sealed. A room inside one of the most thoroughly studied buildings on Earth, discovered using particles falling from space, and still, right now, nobody has ever actually seen what's inside it. Some rooms were sealed by their builders, Others were sealed suddenly and completely by a mountain. The library turned to stone by a volcano. In 79 CE, when Mount Vesuvius erupted and buried the towns around the Bay of Naples, one villa on the outskirts of Herculaneum was buried so completely and so specifically that it preserved something almost nothing else from the ancient world survived, with an entire private library still in its original room. Nearly 2,000 papyrus scrolls were found there, carbonized by the intense heat into fragile, blackened lumps that looked, for centuries after their rediscovery in the 1750s, more like lumps of charcoal than books. Early attempts to unroll them often destroyed them completely. For over 200 years, most of these scrolls sat essentially unreadable, their contents locked inside carbonized rolls too fragile to open. Then, starting in the early 2020s, researchers began using X-ray scanning and artificial intelligence to virtually unroll and read the scrolls without physically touching them at all, successfully making out real, legible passages of ancient Greek philosophy for the first time in nearly 2 millennia. The villa's full library still hasn't been completely excavated or read. An entire ancient room of books, buried by catastrophe, preserved by that same catastrophe, and only now, slowly, starting to speak again. A room that a volcano ended, and that same volcano, without meaning to, quietly kept safe for nearly 2,000 years. One villa's library survived by accident. A whole town nearby survived in an even stranger way, not destroyed, but paused. The rooms frozen mid-afternoon. Not far from Herculaneum, a smaller, wealthier villa at a site called Oplontis was buried by the same eruption and preserved so completely that its rooms still show details of daily life interrupted mid-motion. The villa, believed by some historians to have belonged to the family of Emperor Nero's wife Poppaea, contains elaborately painted rooms with frescoes so vividly preserved that their original colors, deep reds, golds, and blues, remain visible today, nearly 2,000 years after they were painted, protected the entire time under layers of volcanic ash and pumice. In one storage room, excavators found painted walls beside practical household items, undisturbed exactly as they'd been left. A rare, complete snapshot of how a genuinely wealthy Roman household actually organized and decorated its private spaces, rather than the more public, ceremonial rooms usually preserved elsewhere. Unlike Pompeii, Oplontis has no human remains found within the villa itself, suggesting its occupants had time to flee before the worst of the eruption arrived, leaving the rooms themselves as the only witnesses left behind. Painted walls, waiting in the dark for almost 2,000 years, holding their colors patiently for residents who, this time, actually got the chance to leave. Some rooms were preserved by chance. Others were preserved on purpose to hold the dead for as long as the stone itself would last. The underground rooms built for a city of the dead. Beneath the city of Alexandria, Egypt, a set of underground burial chambers called Kum el Shoqafa, meaning mound of shards, for the broken pottery once found scattered nearby, descends across 3 separate levels, carved directly into solid rock roughly 2,000 years ago. The complex was rediscovered by accident in 1900 when, according to popular local accounts, a donkey pulling a cart fell through the ground into an unseen shaft below, revealing an elaborate multi-level tomb complex that had sat undisturbed for centuries. What makes the site remarkable is its blend of cultures. The carvings combine ancient Egyptian funerary imagery, gods like Anubis and Sobek, with distinctly Greek and Roman architectural style and clothing, a physical record of Alexandria's identity as a genuine melting point between civilizations, carved into the walls of a room built specifically to be visited only by the dead and whoever came to bury them. The lowest level of the complex now sits permanently flooded by rising groundwater, inaccessible to modern visitors. A final room built 2,000 years ago that the water table itself has now quietly sealed all over again. 3 levels down, carved for the dead, blending 2 cultures into one stone room, with its lowest chamber now resting, once again, somewhere no living visitor can currently follow. Some underground rooms held the dead. One, cut straight down into rock, was built to reach something the living needed just as badly: water. The shaft that kept a city alive under siege. Beneath the ancient city of David, the oldest core of Jerusalem, a vertical shaft cut down through solid bedrock connects the city above to a natural spring far below, a feat of engineering usually dated to sometime in the Bronze or early Iron Age. Named after Charles Warren, the British engineer who first explored and documented it in 1867, Warren's shaft allowed residents to access fresh water from the Ganges spring without leaving the safety of the city's walls, a critical advantage during a siege when an exposed water source outside the walls could easily be cut off or poisoned by attackers. For decades, some scholars proposed this very shaft might be the water shaft mentioned in the Bible's second book of Samuel, in the story of King David's forces capturing the city, an evocative theory that later, more precise excavation has complicated, since further study suggests the shaft may not have been usable for water access quite that early after all. Regardless of exactly when it was first used, the tunnel system connected to it remained functional for centuries, part of a broader network of ancient water tunnels beneath the city that both archaeologists and tourists can still walk through today. A vertical room cut straight down through solid rock, built for the oldest and simplest reason any hidden room has ever been built: to keep the people above it safely, quietly alive. Some rooms were carved for water, others were carved simply for movement, long, hidden galleries built to let people pass unseen. The hidden hallways Roman nobles walked through unseen. In many grand Roman villas, alongside the open colonnades and sunlit courtyards, there was often another kind of passage entirely: the cryptoporticus, a covered, partially underground gallery lit only by small openings along its upper wall, running beneath or alongside the main structure above. These long vaulted corridors, kept naturally cool by the surrounding earth, served several quiet purposes at once. They allowed servants and household staff to move between different parts of a villa without crossing through the more formal, visible rooms used for entertaining. They also functioned as practical shelter from the harsh midday sun, offering a shaded walking gallery during the hottest parts of the day. Some of the best preserved examples survive beneath sites like the Domus Aurea in Rome and the sprawling Villa Adriana outside the city. Long, dim, gently curving spaces, their plastered walls, sometimes still bearing traces of decorative painting, built specifically to be a functional in-between space, not a destination in itself. A room, or rather an entire hidden hallway, built for exactly the opposite of grandeur, meant only to be walked through, quietly, by people whose job was to remain, as much as possible, unseen. Somewhere beneath the ruins of a Roman villa, a long, cool passage still curves gently through the dark, built for footsteps that were never meant to be noticed at all. Some hidden rooms let people move freely. One kind of hidden room was built for someone who chose, permanently, never to leave at all. The room a person chose to be sealed inside. In medieval Europe, a small number of deeply devout men and women chose a form of religious life almost unimaginable today, becoming an anchorite, being formally, ceremonially sealed inside a small stone cell, usually attached to a church wall, for the remainder of their life. The ceremony marking this choice closely resembled a funeral rite. The anchorite would be led into their cell, and the local bishop would perform last rites over them as though they had died, before the entrance was sealed with stone or brick, sometimes leaving only a small window, called a squint, through which they could hear church services and receive food. This wasn't imprisonment in the way we'd understand it today. It was a chosen, voluntary devotion, and some anchorites became respected spiritual advisors, their small window becoming a place where townspeople came to seek counsel and comfort, speaking through the narrow opening to someone who had permanently withdrawn from ordinary life to be closer, in their belief, to God. The most famous surviving anchorite writings come from Julian of Norwich, a 14th century English anchoress whose reflections, written from inside her sealed cell attached to St. Julian's Church, are still read and studied today, nearly 700 years later. A room sealed by choice rather than chance, from which some of the gentlest, most quietly enduring words in English religious writing were spoken through a small stone window to whoever happened to stop and listen. Some rooms sheltered devotion, others sheltered people who had to hide simply to survive. The rooms built into the walls to hide a person. In England, following the Reformation, practicing the Catholic faith openly became dangerous and eventually illegal, punishable by fines, imprisonment, or worse for anyone caught sheltering a Catholic priest. In response, wealthy Catholic families who continued practicing in secret commissioned skilled builders, most famously a family of craftsmen led by Nicholas Owen, to construct hidden chambers within their homes, cleverly built into chimneys, staircases, and false walls, designed specifically to conceal a priest during a raid. Owen, who worked alone and largely at night to keep his methods secret even from the families he served, built priest holes so cleverly disguised that some went undiscovered for centuries. One, found at a manor called Harvington Hall, was hidden so effectively behind a false chimney breast that searchers of the era, even those who suspected something was there, simply couldn't locate the entrance. Priests hiding in these spaces sometimes had to remain still and silent for days at a time, while search parties tore through the house around them. Some spaces barely large enough to crouch in, with only a small breathing gap connecting them to the outside air. Owen himself was eventually captured in 1606, tortured and killed rather than reveal the location of any hiding place he'd built, taking, quite literally, some of his own hidden rooms' exact locations to his grave. Some hidden rooms sheltered the persecuted. Beneath one city, an entire hidden world of vaults was simply forgotten and left to fill quietly with rubbish and rumor. The vaults a whole city forgot it had built. In the late 1780s, the city of Edinburgh built a grand new bridge called South Bridge to connect two hills across a steep valley. And beneath its 19 supporting arches, builders created a series of small vaulted chambers, initially rented out as storage, workshops, and taverns for the city's tradespeople. The vaults, however, were poorly waterproofed from the start, and within a few decades, damp and flooding made most of them unsuitable for legitimate business. By the early 1800s, the respectable tenants had largely moved out, and the vaults became home instead to the city's poorest residents, packed into damp, unlit underground chambers just below the busy street above. Eventually, even that population moved on, and the vaults were sealed up and simply forgotten, filled gradually with rubble and debris, their existence fading from the city's own memory for well over a century. They were rediscovered in the 1980s when a local business owner, investigating a persistent damp smell in his cellar, broke through a wall and found himself standing in a room nobody living had any record of, leading to a full excavation that has since reopened much of the vault network to the public. A whole neighborhood, built, lived in, abandoned, sealed, and quietly forgotten by an entire city, rediscovered only because someone followed a smell of damp through what he thought was just an ordinary cellar wall. One city forgot vaults it had built for the living. Another built rooms, deliberately, for a much older, quieter purpose, making space for the dead. The city underneath the city of light. By the late 1700s, Paris had a serious problem. Its cemeteries, some in continuous use since the Middle Ages, were dangerously overcrowded, with mass graves so full that in 1780, a cemetery wall near the Isle Market actually collapsed under the pressure, spilling human remains into a neighboring basement. The city's solution was to relocate millions of skeletal remains into a network of former limestone quarry tunnels that already ran beneath the city, a project that continued for decades, ultimately transferring the remains of an estimated 6 million people into these underground galleries. Rather than simply piling the bones, later organizers arranged them with a strange, deliberate artistry. Femurs and skulls stacked into decorative patterns along the tunnel walls, transforming what could have been a simple mass dumping ground into something closer to a somber, carefully composed monument. Today, only a small section of this vast tunnel network, known as the Paris Catacombs, is open to the public. Roughly a mile of walkway out of more than 200 miles of tunnels that quietly run beneath the city, most sealed off, unlit, and closed to visitors entirely. 6 million people rehoused underground, arranged with quiet care, beneath a city that spends its daylight hours calling itself the City of Light. Some cities built rooms methodically with purpose. One man in California built rooms with almost no purpose at all, for nearly 40 years without stopping. The house that kept building itself for 40 years. In San Jose, California, a widow named Sarah Winchester, heir to the Winchester Repeating Arms fortune, purchased an unfinished farmhouse in 1886 and, according to most accounts, kept construction going on it continuously around the clock for the next 38 years until her death in 1922. The result is one of the strangest houses ever built. Staircases that climb up and dead end directly into a ceiling. Doors that open onto blank walls or a straight drop to the yard below. A room built, according to some accounts, specifically because Sarah disliked the number 13, except one room, deliberately, has exactly 13 bathrooms, and another window features exactly 13 panes of glass. Popular legend has long claimed Sarah built this way on the advice of a medium, believing she needed to continuously confuse the spirits of those killed by Winchester rifles, and that construction could never stop, or she herself would die. Historians studying her actual letters and estate records have found little solid evidence for that specific story, suggesting the truth may be simpler. An eccentric, wealthy woman with a genuine architectural hobby and no need to ever finish. Whatever her real reasons, the house that resulted has 160 rooms, 10,000 windows, and staircases and doorways that, to this day, lead confidently and precisely absolutely nowhere at all. A house built for nearly 40 straight years by someone who may never have intended it to actually be finished. Its unfinished rooms now permanently, deliberately, exactly as unfinished as she left them. One house had rooms leading nowhere on purpose. High in the Andes, one small cave chamber was carved with the opposite intention, leading precisely toward the moon. The cave carved to frame the moon. Below the main citadel of Machu Picchu in Peru, a natural cave was expanded and refined by Inca stoneworkers into a carefully finished interior chamber, now commonly called the Temple of the Moon, tucked into the mountainside beneath the more famous ruins above. Inside, Inca masons carved a stepped stone altar and niches directly into the cave's natural rock, blending finely worked, precisely fitted stonework seamlessly into the surrounding raw cave walls, a hallmark of Inca architecture, working with a landscape rather than simply building on top of it. The chamber's name and exact original purpose remain genuinely debated among researchers. Some believe its alignment and carved features connect it to lunar observation and ceremony, while others argue the astronomical connection has been somewhat overstated by later popular accounts, and that its true function may have been more directly tied to Inca ancestor worship or mountain spirit reverence, broader concepts central to Inca religious life. What's not in dispute is the craftsmanship. Carved doorways and altar steps, fitted with the same obsessive precision found throughout the Inca world, applied here not to a grand open plaza, but to a quiet, easily missed chamber tucked into the mountain below the crowds. A finished room carved carefully into unfinished rock, its exact purpose still argued over. One more small, precise mystery tucked beneath a much more famous one. Some hidden rooms sit in mountains. One sits beneath one of the grandest theaters ever built, and it's genuinely full of water. The underground lake beneath the Opera House. When construction began on the Palais Garnier, the Grand Paris Opera House, in 1861, workers digging the foundation hit an unexpected problem. Groundwater from a nearby underground stream kept flooding the excavation site, no matter how persistently it was pumped out. Rather than fight the water indefinitely, the building's architect, Charles Garnier, adapted his design, constructing a large concrete cistern beneath the opera house, specifically to contain and manage the water, both stabilizing the foundation above and, as a side effect, creating a genuine underground reservoir directly beneath the building. This real underground lake, still there today, partly inspired the setting of Gaston Leroux's 1910 novel about a mysterious figure living in the depths beneath the opera house. A story later adapted into one of the most successful stage musicals in history. In reality, the cistern serves a far less dramatic role. Paris firefighters still use it today for regular training exercises, practicing underwater rescue techniques in the same dark, cavernous, water-filled chamber that quietly inspired one of the world's most famous fictional hiding places. A flooding problem solved with concrete that accidentally built a real lake beneath a real opera house and gave an entire genre of ghost story somewhere real to live. Some rooms were built beneath a building on purpose. One was found, completely by accident, beneath the floor of one of the most visited buildings in the world. The coffin nobody knew was under the floor. In 2019, a devastating fire tore through the roof of Notre-Dame Cathedral in Paris, and during the restoration work that followed, archaeologists conducting a routine survey beneath the cathedral floor made an unexpected discovery in 2022. a lead sarcophagus buried roughly 3 feet underground in a spot with no prior record of a burial. Careful excavation revealed the coffin had partially collapsed under the sarcophagus's own weight over the centuries, but the human remains inside were remarkably well preserved by the anaerobic, low-oxygen environment created by the sealed lead casing. Scientific analysis suggested the remains belonged to a man in his 30s, likely a senior church official, based on his high-status burial position near the center of the cathedral's transept and skeletal evidence suggesting he'd spent much of his life on horseback, consistent with clergy of high social rank in medieval France, though his exact identity has not been conclusively confirmed. The find had sat, undisturbed and entirely unrecorded in any surviving cathedral document, directly beneath the feet of millions of tourists and worshippers for what researchers estimate could be several hundred years, discovered only because a catastrophic fire forced open the floor above it. A hidden room the size of a single coffin, sitting quietly beneath one of the most photographed floors on Earth, waiting for a fire nobody wanted to finally be noticed again. Notre-Dame kept one room secret by accident. Not far away, an entire institution kept its rooms secret quite deliberately for centuries, by name alone. The archive that was secret simply by its name. Deep within Vatican City sits an enormous archive, formally established in its current form in 1612, holding centuries of documents central to the history of the Catholic Church and, by extension, much of European history. Correspondence, official records, and papal decrees stretching back over 1,000 years. For most of its existence, it was formerly known as the Vatican Secret Archive, a name that fueled centuries of popular speculation about forbidden knowledge hidden within. In reality, historians note, secret in this context descended from the older Latin sense of private or personal, referring to the Pope's own private collection, rather than suggesting deliberately concealed or scandalous contents. Qualified scholars have actually been permitted to request and study specific documents from the archive since the late 1800s, though access requires formal application and, historically, has depended on the material not being too recent or sensitive to release. In 2019, partly to address the persistent misunderstanding around its name, Pope Francis officially renamed it the Vatican Apostolic Archive. The exact same rooms, the exact same 80-some kilometers of shelving, simply relieved, after 4 centuries, of a name that had always meant something quieter than the mystery people had built around it. A room whose greatest secret, in the end, may have simply been its own name, misunderstood for centuries by people who never got the chance to ask what secret actually used to mean. Some rooms guarded documents, some guarded something far more urgent, the outcome of a war, decided by people working in secret against the clock. The room where a single decoded message changed a war. Inside the old Admiralty building in London, during the First World War, a small, secretive group of code breakers worked in a room simply designated Room 40. its bland, forgettable name deliberately chosen to attract no attention at all. In January 1917, the team intercepted and decoded a German diplomatic cable sent from Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann, proposing a secret alliance with Mexico against the United States, offering in exchange for Mexican support help reclaiming territory lost decades earlier in the Mexican-American War. The decoded telegram, carefully passed to the United States while concealing exactly how it had been intercepted, became a major factor in shifting American public opinion toward entering the war. A single decoded message produced inside one unremarkable room, quietly reshaping the entire course of a global conflict. Room 40's very existence and the fact that Britain had been reading supposedly secure German communications throughout the war remained closely guarded even after the war ended. The room itself, long since repurposed, its wartime function kept quiet for years after the door had, in every practical sense, already closed. One ordinary-looking room, one intercepted message, and a war's direction quietly, deliberately nudged by people whose names, for a long time, nobody outside that room was allowed to know either. One quiet room shortened one war. Decades later, a much larger operation, spread across dozens of huts, worked to shorten another. The huts where a machine's code was broken by hand and by wit. At Bletchley Park, a country estate roughly 50 miles northwest of London, thousands of code breakers, mathematicians, and support staff worked in a scattered collection of huts and buildings during the Second World War, trying to break Germany's Enigma machine ciphers. Hut 8, led for a time by mathematician Alan Turing, focused specifically on German naval Enigma traffic, considered the most difficult version to crack since German U-boats posed one of the gravest threats to Britain's supply lines across the Atlantic. Turing and his colleagues helped design an electromechanical device called the Bombay, which dramatically sped up the process of testing possible Enigma settings, turning what could have taken human codebreakers years into a process measured in hours. Work later credited by some historians with shortening the war by a meaningful margin and saving countless lives as a direct result. For decades after the war, everyone involved was bound by strict secrecy, forbidden from discussing their work even with close family, and the full scope of Bletchley Park's achievements only became publicly known starting in the 1970s, meaning many who worked in those huts lived out most of their lives never able to fully explain what they'd actually spent the war doing. Rooms full of people solving, by hand and by wit, one of the hardest puzzles of the 20th century, and then quietly, dutifully, saying nothing about it for 30 years afterward. Some wartime rooms cracked codes above ground. One set of rooms, dug deep beneath London itself, ran an entire war from underneath the city. The bunker where a prime minister ran a war from underground. Beneath the streets of Westminster in London, a converted basement complex now known as the Churchill War Rooms served as a secret underground headquarters for the British government throughout the Second World War, from 1939 until the war's end in 1945. Reinforced with a thick layer of concrete for protection against bombing, the complex housed a map room staffed around the clock, tracking troop movements and convoy positions on walls covered with pinned charts, some still bearing the actual pinholes and marks from wartime use, preserved exactly as they were left on the day the lights were finally switched off. Winston Churchill himself made several of his wartime radio broadcasts from a small room within the complex, and a private, closely guarded room housed a direct transatlantic telephone line to the White House, disguised for secrecy as an ordinary broom closet-sized space, its true purpose known to only a small handful of staff. When the war ended, the rooms were simply locked and left almost entirely as they were. Some lights left burning, some paperwork left mid-task on desks, an underground government fully preserved in place, not reconstructed later, opened to the public decades afterward, largely unchanged. An entire underground government switched off in a single afternoon in 1945 and left, in large part, exactly as it stood in that final wartime moment. One set of hidden rooms ran a war from underground. Another small hidden room in Amsterdam simply tried to survive it. The bookcase that hid an entire family. At Prinsengracht 263 in Amsterdam, behind a swinging bookcase installed to conceal the entrance, a small annex of rooms above a canal-side warehouse sheltered 8 people in hiding from July 1942 until August 1944 during the Nazi occupation of the Netherlands. Among them was a teenage girl named Anne Frank, whose diary, kept during those 2 years in hiding, has since become one of the most widely read personal accounts of the Holocaust ever published, offering an unusually direct, personal window into daily life spent in complete, prolonged confinement and fear. The rooms themselves were small and cramped, their windows permanently covered to prevent any light from revealing signs of occupation to the outside world. The occupants required to stay almost completely silent during the business hours below, when warehouse workers unaware of their presence carried on their ordinary jobs just downstairs. In August 1944, acting on a tip whose source has never been definitively confirmed, police raided the annex and arrested everyone hiding there. Anne died in the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp in early 1945, only weeks before the camp's liberation. Her father, Otto Frank, was the only one of the 8 to survive the war, and later worked to have her diary published. A bookcase, a few small rooms, and 2 years lived almost entirely in silence, preserved today, deliberately left unfurnished, exactly as they were found, so that what happened there is never quietly smoothed over or forgotten. Some hidden rooms sat above ground, in silence. On the other side of the world, decades later, an entire hidden world was dug beneath it instead. The tunnels with kitchens, hospitals, and rooms to sleep. Northwest of what is now Ho Chi Minh City, Vietnam, a network of tunnels dug over decades, starting in the late 1940s and massively expanded during the Vietnam War, eventually stretched for well over 100 miles, connecting an entire hidden underground world beneath the district of Cu Chi. Far more than simple crawl spaces, the tunnel network included multiple levels, kitchens with cleverly designed chimneys that dispersed cooking smoke gradually through multiple hidden vents to avoid detection, field hospitals, sleeping quarters, weapons workshops, and command rooms, an entire functioning underground settlement, in some sections barely large enough for an adult to move through comfortably. The tunnels were deliberately built with narrow, twisting passages and camouflaged trapdoor entrances, sometimes booby-trapped against intruders, making them extraordinarily difficult for opposing forces to locate, navigate, or clear, even when their general location was suspected. Today, a preserved section of the tunnel network is open to visitors. Some passages widened slightly from their original wartime dimensions to accommodate modern tourists. A hidden underground world, once built entirely for concealment and survival, now walked through, briefly and by choice, by people who can simply climb back out into daylight whenever they're ready. An entire hidden settlement threaded beneath the forest floor, room by narrow room, built not to be discovered, and, for a great many of the years it mattered most, never fully was. Some hidden rooms were dug for survival. One kind of hidden room, in a very different city, was built simply to break an unpopular law, one quiet drink at a time. The rooms hidden behind an ordinary storefront. When the United States enacted nationwide prohibition in 1920, banning the sale of alcoholic beverages, an entire hidden hospitality industry sprang up almost overnight to quietly ignore it. The speakeasy, a hidden bar or club, often concealed behind an entirely ordinary, unremarkable storefront. In New York City alone, estimates from the era suggest there may have been anywhere from 20 to 100,000 speakeasies operating at Prohibition's peak, hidden behind fake walls, false bookshelves, unmarked basement doors, and businesses like laundromats or funeral parlors that served as a legitimate-looking front for the real business happening in a hidden room just behind or below it. Many required a password or a specific coded knock at the door and kept lookouts posted to warn of approaching police raids, giving patrons enough time to hide drinks or slip out through a secondary, equally hidden exit before officers made it inside. A handful of these hidden rooms still exist today, repurposed as intentionally retro-styled modern bars that lean into their speakeasy history, some occupying the very same hidden rooms behind the very same disguised entrances that once quietly broke the law for over a decade before Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933. An entire hidden layer of city life tucked behind bookshelves and laundromat counters, proof that a law can ban a drink, but has a much harder time banning the very human urge to find a quiet, hidden room to share one anyway. Some hidden rooms hid a drink. One hidden room, discovered beneath a modern city street, turned out to be hiding an entire god. the temple found beneath a bomb site. In 1954, construction workers clearing rubble from a London site damaged during the Blitz uncovered the stone foundations of a small, previously unknown Roman temple, buried roughly 18 feet below the modern street. The temple, built around 240 CE, had been dedicated to Mithras, a god worshipped through a secretive, initiation-based religion popular among Roman soldiers and merchants. Its ceremonies conducted deliberately out of public view, inside a deep, windowless chamber designed to evoke a cave lit only by flickering torchlight. The 1954 discovery caused an immediate sensation, with tens of thousands of Londoners queuing daily to see the site before construction resumed, leading to the temple's remains being moved and displayed nearby for decades, a compromise between preservation and the pressing need to keep rebuilding a city still recovering from the war. In 2017, the temple was carefully reconstructed at its original location and depth, now displayed to the public in a deliberately dim, atmospheric underground space intended to recreate something close to its original mysterious ambiance, a hidden room, twice hidden now, first by history and then by careful design. A secret god's secret room, buried by time, uncovered by a bomb's aftermath, and finally given back some of its original darkness on purpose, nearly 2,000 years after it was first built to hold it. A god's room, hidden and rediscovered. One emperor's room, we're fairly sure, is still down there right now. Nobody has dared to open it. The emperor's room nobody has ever opened. Near the city of Xi'an, China, beneath a large earthen mound, lies the still sealed burial chamber of Qin Shi Huang, China's first unified emperor, who died in 210 BCE. The surrounding site is already famous for the terracotta army discovered nearby in 1974. Thousands of life-sized soldiers buried to guard the emperor in the afterlife. But the emperor's actual burial chamber, described in detail by the ancient historian Sima Qian roughly a century after the emperor's death, has never been excavated at all. Sima Qian's account describes an almost unbelievable interior, a scale model of the emperor's entire empire, complete with rivers and seas rendered in flowing mercury, a ceiling inlaid with pearls to represent the night sky, and crossbow traps engineered to fire automatically at any intruder who breached the chamber. Modern soil samples taken from the mound have actually shown unusually high concentrations of mercury in the surrounding earth, lending real physical support to at least part of Sima Qian's ancient description. Chinese archaeologists have deliberately chosen not to open the tomb, citing both respect for the site and concerns that current preservation technology isn't yet advanced enough to protect whatever's inside once the seal is finally broken. A room fully described in writing over 2,000 years ago, its location precisely known, sitting completely sealed right now, tonight, deliberately left closed, because the people who could open it have decided, for now, that some rooms are better left exactly as they are. That's where we'll leave it tonight. A door that stayed shut for 3,000 years. A room that fills with light once a year. A stone shelf wading through sand. A library saved by the fire that destroyed it. A palace tangled up with a myth. A void found without anyone going in. A library turned to stone by a volcano. Rooms frozen mid-afternoon. A city of the dead carved into rock. A shaft cut down to keep a city alive. A hidden hallway built for footsteps meant to go unnoticed. A room a person chose to be sealed inside. A space built into a wall to hide someone. A whole neighborhood a city simply forgot. 6 million people rehoused with quiet care beneath the city of light. A house that never stopped building itself. A cave carved carefully to frame the moon. A lake that inspired a ghost story. A coffin nobody knew was under the floor. An archive whose only real secret was its own name. One decoded message, and a war's direction quietly nudged. Huts full of people solving an impossible puzzle, then saying nothing for 30 years. An underground government switched off in a single afternoon. A bookcase and 2 years lived almost entirely in silence. An entire settlement threaded beneath a forest floor. Rooms hidden behind an ordinary storefront. A god's room, buried, found, and given its darkness back, and an emperor's room, fully described, precisely located, and still, right now, tonight, sealed. None of it needs solving tonight. It never did. If your eyes are already closed, that's exactly where they should be. And if they're still open, just a little, there's another quiet room waiting right after this one, whenever you're ready. No rush, no sound, just drifting gently into whatever comes next.